The iron ladle slipped from Clara Bennett's hand and struck the jailyard table so hard that every pretty pie, polished plate, and laughing face in Dusthaven turned toward her. She froze beside a battered stew pot, a heavy woman in a worn brown dress and flour-stained apron standing at the back of a public cook selection she had never meant to enter. Her cheeks burned. Her hands shook. The stew inside that old pot was all she had brought, and it looked plain enough to be mocked before a single spoon touched it. Sheriff Amos Pike leaned against the jailhouse post with a grin too wide for kindness. "Pick any cook, Walker," he called loud enough for the whole town to hear. "A man your size needs a woman who can keep him fed." The crowd laughed, and that laugh moved through Clara like a knife dragged slow. Vivian Hart stood near the front in a blue dress trimmed with white lace, her apple pie shining under a folded cloth, her smile sweet enough to hide poison. She looked Clara up and down, then whispered something that made the women beside her cover their mouths. And here is the part. Folks in Dusthaven never forgot. Ethan Walker did not laugh. He stood taller than any man in that yard, nearly 2 full yards of bone muscle beard and quiet, weathered strength. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his gaze missed nothing. He saw the women who had dressed for him. He saw the sheriff making sport of hunger and pride. And he saw Clara already reaching for the pot handles ready to carry away the only thing in that yard made with honest hands. "Leave it," Ethan said. Clara looked up as if the word had struck her. "It ain't fit for a table like this," she murmured. "I only brought it because Mrs. Bell said there might be ranch hands needing something warm after the choosing." Vivian gave a soft laugh. How generous. She brought enough for all of Texas. Another ripple of amusement passed through the yard. Clara lowered her eyes, and in that moment the danger was not a gun or a blade. It was worse in a quieter way. It was a whole town teaching one woman to disappear. Ethan stepped past the pies, past the roast dressed with parsley, past the sugared biscuits arranged like Sunday flowers. He stopped before Clara's old stew pot, took the dented tin spoon from beside it and tasted one careful mouthful. The yard went still. Ethan did not speak right away. He swallowed, looked at the stew, then looked at Clara, as though he had found something the whole town had stepped over for years. Sheriff Pike chuckled. "Well, you can choose any cook here." Ethan set the spoon down. "I choose her." For one breath, nobody moved. Then Dusthaven erupted. Clara's hands flew to her apron. Vivian's smile vanished. The sheriff straightened off the post, thinking he must have heard wrong. But Ethan Walker only reached for Clara's stew pot as if the choice had already been made long before anyone gave him permission. And from the far edge of the crowd, Vivian Hart watched them with eyes sharp enough to promise this was not finished. Sheriff Pike's laugh came back first thin and uncertain, like a man trying to turn a mistake into a joke before the town noticed his hand shaking. "Now, Walker," he said, stepping away from the jailhouse post. No need to make sport of the day. "I said pick any cook. You got Vivian Hart right there. Mrs. Lyle with her smoked roast and 3 widows who can make biscuits, stand up and sing." Ethan did not look at any of them. He lifted Clara's stew pot with both hands, though even full it looked small against him. "I heard you." Clara moved closer, panic rising in her throat. "Mr. Walker, please don't do this on account of me. I know how folks talk. You don't owe me a kindness in front of everybody. I don't hire out of kindness," Ethan said. The words should have sounded cold, but they steadied her. He picked up the tin spoon, again turned it in his fingers, and glanced toward the long table where the prettier dishes sat untouched by dust and work. "This tastes like somebody remembered men get tired. It tastes like somebody salted it with sense instead of pride. My ranch don't need decoration. It needs supper." The yard went quiet enough for Clara to hear her own breathing. No one in Dusthaven had ever spoken of her cooking that way in daylight. They had eaten her biscuits in the diner, praised Mrs. Bell for the gravy Clara had stirred, asked for second bowls of soup without asking whose hands had made it. Clara had learned to pass food through doorways and disappear before compliments needed a name. Vivian Hart folded her lace-gloved hands. "How touching," she said, "though I expect ranch hands are easier to please than decent company." Ethan turned then, slow and calm. "Hungry men are honest judges." A few cowhands near the hitching rail chuckled before catching themselves. Vivian's face tightened. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat, uneasy now that the joke had stopped belonging to him. "Well, Miss Bennett, seems you got yourself work at Walker Ridge." Clara should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt exposed. The crowd's eyes crawled over her dress, her apron, her broad shoulders, the hands she did not know where to put. She wanted the ground to open and swallow the table, the stew, and every ounce of her hope before someone mocked it. Ethan seemed to understand without making a show of it. He shifted his body between Clara and the worst of the staring faces, then nodded toward his wagon. "Best we get that pot covered before the dust takes it." That was the first shelter he gave her. Not a speech, not a grand defense, just his wide back between her and the town. The ride to Walker Ridge began with no music, no soft talk, and no promise Clara could trust. Ethan drove the team with steady hands, while the stew pot sat covered between them, its iron lid tied down with a strip of cloth. Clara kept both hands in her lap and watched Dusthaven shrink behind the wagon wheels. After a long while, she said, "They'll say you chose wrong. They already said plenty, before I chose at all." "That's different." "How?" She swallowed, "before they were only laughing at me." Ethan did not answer quickly. The road climbed through dry grass and low mesquite toward the dark line of Walker Ridge. "Then they've been wrong, longer than today." The words settled beside her, too simple to argue with and too heavy to ignore. Walker Ridge Ranch came into view near sundown, spread wide under a copper sky. The place had strong bones. Weathered barns, long fences, a bunkhouse leaning into the wind, and a main house with a porch broad enough for summer evenings. But Clara saw the neglect before she saw the beauty. Empty flour sacks piled near the kitchen door, a wash tub gone sour, coffee grounds dumped where chickens scratched, men moving slow from work, not lazy, just worn thin by bad meals and long days. Inside the kitchen was worse. The stove was cold. Grease blackened the iron plates. The pantry shelves held beans, cornmeal, salt, pork, potatoes, dried apples, molasses, flour, coffee, and enough good staples to feed men well for weeks. Yet everything had been opened, carelessly wasted by neglect, or left to harden in sacks. Ethan stood in the doorway as if he knew the room had failed some test. Last cook left after the spring drive. Since then the men been managing. Clara looked at a pan with burned beans stuck to the bottom like roofing tar. Managing is a generous word. For the first time that day, Ethan almost smiled. He reached into his vest pocket and placed a brass key on the work table. "Kitchen's yours. Pantry too. If a man complains, send him to me." Clara stared at the key. It was not pretty. It was scratched dull and warm from his pocket. But to her it felt more dangerous than ridicule. A key meant trust. A key meant if she failed, she would fail where everyone could see. "I'm just a cook," she said. "No," Ethan replied. "You're the reason every man here may work better tomorrow than he did today." She looked away before that sentence could reach too deep. By nightfall, Clara had the stove breathing again. She scraped pans, sorted shelves, cut away spoiled edges, and turned what others had overlooked into supper. Salt pork browned with onions, potatoes softened in broth, cornbread rose in a black skillet, coffee boiled strong enough to wake the dead and kind enough to forgive the living. The ranch hands came in loud, then went quiet when the smell met them. One by one they filled plates. One by one they stopped talking. A grey-bearded hand named Silas took a bite of cornbread, looked down at it, and removed his hat as if he had walked into church. "Ma'am," he said, "is there more?" Clara blinked. "Plenty." That single word changed the room. Men who had been eating like animals over a trough sat slower. Someone passed the butter instead of grabbing. Someone laughed without meanness in it. Ethan leaned near the door, arms crossed, watching not Clara's size, not the flower on her sleeve, but the way tired men remembered they were human around her table. When the dishes were done, Clara set aside the smallest bowl for herself and stood near the stove to eat it. Ethan noticed. He pulled out a chair at the end of the table. "Sit. I'm fine here. No woman feeds this ranch standing in a corner." The room held its breath. Clara looked at the chair as if it belonged to someone better dressed, smaller, easier to admire. Then she sat. No one laughed. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls. Inside the kitchen held warm. For a little while, Clara let herself believe the worst of the day had passed. Then a horse came hard up the road from Dusthaven, and Silas stepped to the window with his cup still in hand. "Rider at the gate," he said. "Looks like town business." The rider at the gate was not trouble with a gun, but Clara felt her stomach tighten all the same when she saw Vivian Hart step down from a borrowed buggy with a covered pie balanced in both hands. She had not come dressed for ranch dust. Her blue traveling dress was clean, her gloves white, her hair pinned as if she expected every man on Walker Ridge to stop work and admire the effort. Sheriff Pike rode behind her, looking uncomfortable enough to prove he had not chosen the errand on his own. Ethan met them on the porch before they reached the kitchen door. "Afternoon." Vivian smiled past him straight toward Clara. "I brought a pie for your men, Mr. Walker. I thought they might enjoy something with a proper touch. It must be dreadful, eating nothing but heavy stew day after day." Clara stood inside the doorway with flour on her hands. The kitchen behind her smelled of yeast coffee and beef broth. She had been kneading dough for tomorrow's breakfast, and the work had put colour in her cheeks until Vivian's voice took it away. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat. "No harm meant. Miss Hart was headed this direction, and I figured I'd ask whether your new cook was settling in." Ethan did not move aside. "She settled." Vivian's smile sharpened. How fortunate. Still, a ranch like this needs more than a woman who can fill plates. A man of your standing needs someone fit to be seen beside him when folks come visiting. The ranch hands near the corral went still. Silas, carrying a feed sack across one shoulder, slowed just enough to hear. Clara lowered her hands into her apron, pressing the flour into the cloth because it was better than letting anyone see them tremble. Ethan took the pie from Vivian, looked down at it, then handed it back. At Walker Ridge, the woman who warms the house may stand anywhere she pleases. Vivian's eyes flickered. Even if the whole town laughs, then the whole town can learn manners. That was the vow. Quiet, plain, and made with his boots planted between Clara and the people who wanted her small. He did not touch his rifle. He did not raise his voice. But every man there understood that Ethan Walker had drawn a line no polished smile would cross. Vivian left with her pie untouched, but she did not leave defeated. At the buggy, she turned just enough for Clara to hear. "Dusthaven will tire of this charity soon. They always do." For the next week, Clara felt the town's laughter travel ahead of her like smoke. At the mercantile, two women stepped in front of her while she waited for yeast. One knocked a sack of flour from her arms and said, "Careful, Miss Bennett. Wouldn't want Dusthaven's biggest cook to go hungry." The store went quiet, but no one bent to help. Sheriff Pike saw it from the doorway and only muttered, "Best not take every little thing to heart." Clara carried the torn sack back to the wagon with flour, dusting her skirt like shame. She told herself she had known worse. She told herself words could not break bone. But that evening at Walker Ridge, She cooked a supper of beans, fried potatoes, and beef gravy, so rich the men wiped their plates clean. Then she set no bowl aside for herself. Ethan noticed before anyone else did. He waited until the hands had left the table, then put a full bowl in front of the chair he had made hers. "Sit down. I'm not hungry." "That ain't true." She looked at the stew and then at the floor. When folks spend all day reminding you there's too much of you, food stops feeling like comfort. Ethan pulled out the chair but did not force her into it. "The sin is theirs, not your supper's." Clara's mouth tightened, fighting a feeling that had no safe place to go. You don't know what it is to walk into a room and see people decide your worth before you speak. "No," Ethan said, "but I know what it is to watch good land nearly die because men judged it too rough to save." He sat across from her, leaving the bowl between them like a peace offering. Walker Ridge was laughed at once. Too rocky, too dry, too far from town. My father kept it because he saw what other men were too impatient to see. Clara looked up. "I reckon people can be land too," Ethan said. "Mistreated long enough they start believing they were born barren." The words did not heal her all at once, but they reached the place in her that still wanted to be believed. Clara sat down. She ate slowly at first, then properly, and Ethan did not watch her like a kindness. He simply stayed as if her taking a meal at her own table was the most natural thing in the world. 2 days later, Sheriff Pike came again, this time without Vivian. He stood in the kitchen doorway, holding his hat in both hands. "Miss Bennett, Dusthaven's autumn fair is Saturday. Cooking contest is part of it. Ranchers, miners, stage drivers doing the judging." Clara kept stirring biscuit dough. "I'm sure Miss Hart will enjoy winning." "That's so?" Ethan asked from beside the stove. The sheriff shifted. "Town would like Walker Ridge represented." Clara gave a small laugh with no joy in it. "The town would like a show." Sheriff Pike had the decency to look down. "Maybe, but some of the men who ate here last week have been talking. Not unkindly. They say your food holds a man up better than pride does." Clara's hand stopped in the dough. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke carefully, not pushing, not rescuing. "You don't owe Dusthaven proof of anything, but if there's a part of you tired of hiding in kitchens, they pretend you don't run. I'll stand close enough that you won't be standing alone." That night, Clara did not sleep much. She mended her brown dress by lamplight, let out a seam where it pinched, washed her apron twice, and lined up the dishes she knew could speak for her better than her mouth ever had. Mountain beef stew, molasses cornbread, and a plain apple skillet cake with more heart than decoration. At dawn, the ranch hands loaded crates into the wagon without teasing. Silas brought a clean cloth for the serving table. One younger hand polished the handles of her pots until they shone dark and honest. No one called it kindness. They just did the work. The fairgrounds at Dusthaven were already loud when Clara arrived. Flags snapped over the pens. Miners crowded near the judging tables. Stage drivers joked by the coffee stand. Vivian stood in the cooking line, wearing cream-colored lace, her pie crust cut into roses, her smile bright for every man who looked her way. Then Clara stepped down from Ethan's wagon, holding her old stew pot against her apron. The laughter started small, but she heard it. She heard every whisper she had feared. Ethan walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. Beside her. When the first serving began, something changed. The ranchers ate Clara's stew and stopped talking. A miner with silver in his beard took one bite of cornbread and closed his eyes. A stage driver asked for another spoonful before he had swallowed the first. Vivian watched the judges scrape Clara's bowls clean, and the color left her face. By late afternoon, Clara's table had the longest line at the fair. For the first time in Dusthaven, people were reaching toward her instead of stepping around her. Clara did not smile proudly. She simply served whoever came hungry. But just before the final round, while Ethan was helping Silas unload more wood near the cookfires and Sheriff Pike was calling names at the judging stand, Vivian slipped behind Clara's table. She looked once toward the crowd, lifted a small sack of salt from beneath her shawl, and moved toward the stew pot that had made the whole town quiet. Vivian did not pour the salt all at once. She tipped it slowly, carefully, as if ruining a woman could be done with the same grace she used to trim a pie crust. The white grains vanished into Clara's dark stew, and for one terrible second, no one saw but a thin young helper at the pickle barrel who froze with both hands full of jars. By the time Clara returned to her table, Vivian was already across the fairground, smiling beside her rose-cut pie, as though she had spent the whole afternoon in plain sight. Clara lifted the ladle. The stew looked the same. It smelled the same. But the moment she tasted it, her face went still. Too much salt. Not a little. Not a careless hand. Enough to make a good pot bitter. Enough to make every judge spit it out and remember only that Clara Bennett, the woman the whole town had laughed at, had finally stepped into daylight and failed where everyone could see. Her fingers tightened around the ladle until her knuckles paled. Vivian drifted close enough for her voice to reach. "Something wrong, Clara." Clara did not answer. "That's the trouble with coming out from behind the stove," Vivian said softly. "Out here, people can see every mistake." The final judging bell rang from the platform. Sheriff Pike called for the last dishes. Around the fairground, plates were being carried forward. Men were taking their places. The whole town was turning toward the contest table. Clara stared into the ruined pot, and for one breath, the old shame rose up so strong it nearly became obedience. She could see herself lifting the handles, carrying the stew away, apologizing to people who had never apologized to her, and returning to Walker Ridge before sundown with one more reason to stay hidden. Then Ethan's shadow fell across the table. He did not curse. He did not storm toward Vivian. He did not take the ladle from Clara's hand. He only looked into the pot, then at Clara. "Can it be saved?" Clara swallowed. "Maybe." "What do you have left?" She turned toward her basket as if seeing it for the first time. A few potatoes. A crock of cream wrapped in a wet cloth. Dried onion. Bones from the beef stock. A heel of bread. A pinch of thyme. Flour dusting the bottom of a sack. The bell rang again. Sheriff Pike shouted, "Final round, cooks! Bring it up!" Vivian smiled wider. Clara drew one hard breath through her nose. "Silas, more water. Hot if you can get it. Mr. Walker, I need that small kettle and the bones." Every ranch hand within hearing moved. Silas ran for water. Another man brought split wood. Ethan lifted the kettle onto the coals and fed the fire until flame licked steady beneath it. Clara's hands trembling a moment before found their old memory. She thinned the ruined stew with bone broth. She peeled potatoes fast, cutting away only what she must, then dropped them into the boil to soften and draw the salt. She tore bread into a skillet and toasted it with beef drippings. She stirred cream in little by little, not enough to make it fancy, just enough to round the harsh edge. Onion went in next. Thyme last. People began to notice. "What's she doing?" someone asked. "Saving supper," Silas muttered. Vivian's face changed for the first time. Not anger. Fear. The pot that should have buried Clara began to change under her hand. It thickened. The sharp salt softened. The stew became something new altogether, a creamy beef and potato soup with toasted bread to carry it. It was not the dish she had promised. It was not the dish the judges expected. But it was warm, honest, and alive. Clara filled the first bowl and carried it to the platform herself. Sheriff Pike looked at it, then looked toward the old stew pot. "Miss Bennett, this ain't what you served earlier." "No, sir," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not break. "Something happened to what I served earlier, so I made what I could with what was left." That answer moved through the crowd. The first judge was a cattle buyer with a hard mouth and harder hands. He tasted the soup and frowned, not in displeasure, but in concentration. The second, an old miner, took his spoonful and stared at the bowl. The third, a stage driver, dipped the toasted bread ate and let out a breath that sounded like a man sitting down after a long road. Vivian stepped forward. "This is improper." The final round was for the same dish. She changed hers. Sheriff Pike hesitated. Vivian had the kind of face Dusthaven liked to believe. Clara had the kind they had spent years ignoring. For a dangerous moment, the official rule looked stronger than the truth in the pot. "She has a point," one judge said slowly. "If the dish was altered, it was ruined," Ethan said. All eyes turned to him. Vivian lifted her chin. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Walker." "I know." Sheriff Pike looked pained. "You see, anyone do it?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He had not. Clara had not. The fairground, so loud an hour before now, turned cautious. People looked at Vivian, then away. The young helper by the pickle barrel gripped her jars so tight one nearly slipped. Sheriff Pike saw her. "Annie." The girl flinched. Vivian turned, smiling with warning under the sweetness. "Careful, Annie. Folks should not speak on what they're unsure of." The girl's eyes dropped. Her mouth opened, then closed. She was no more than a hired helper, thin as a rail paid in coins and leftover preserves. A word against Vivian Hart could cost her work in half the town. Sheriff Pike shifted like a man ready to let silence become convenience. Clara saw it happening. The old pattern. The pretty woman standing clean. The plain truth standing alone. She set both hands on the edge of the table and looked at Annie, not pleading, not demanding. "It's all right," Clara said. "Whatever you saw belongs to you, not to her, not to me." That gentleness did what accusation could not. Annie looked up. Her voice came out small. "I saw Miss Hart by the pot." Vivian laughed once. "Half the fare has been near that table." "With a salt sack," Annie whispered. The crowd tightened. A peddler near the spice wagon raised his hand halfway, then lowered it. Ethan turned his gaze on him, not threatening, only steady. The man cleared his throat. "She bought one from me. Said she'd run short." Vivian's cheeks flushed. "Plenty of cook spice salt." Sheriff Pike walked to Clara's table. He bent, reached beneath the cloth where Vivian had stood earlier, and drew out a small torn sack. White grains clung to the seam. The print on it matched the peddler's mark. For once, Dusthaven had nothing clever to say. Vivian looked from the sack to the sheriff, then to Ethan. "You would humiliate me over soup." "No," Ethan said. "You did that when you tried to make shame do your work." Sheriff Pike climbed onto the judging platform with the sack in hand, and the fairground became as quiet as any courtroom. No judge sat behind a bench. No jury filled a rail. But the town was there, and for Clara Bennett, that mattered more. These were the people who had laughed when she stood behind the jail table. These were the people who now had to decide whether they still preferred a pretty lie. Pike removed his hat. This contest was meant to judge cooking, not character. Seems today it found both. Vivian's eyes flashed. She should not win, because people pity her. The old miner stood from the judge's bench. I don't pity a woman who can turn a spoiled pot into food fit for a cold night. The stage driver nodded. I'd pay for that soup on any road from here to Abilene. The cattle buyer lifted his spoon. Best dish here. A murmur spread, not mocking this time. Agreement. Shame. Surprise. The slow sound of a town changing its mind, one mouthful too late. Sheriff Pike looked at the score slate, then at the judges. Winner of the Dusthaven Autumn Cooking Prize is Clara Bennett of Walker Ridge Ranch. For a moment, Clara could not move. Then applause began near the ranch hands. Silas clapped first loud and stubborn. Another hand joined, then the miner. Then the stage drivers. The sound rolled across the fairground until even those who had laughed that morning were forced either to clap or show the meanness of their silence. Vivian stood rigid beside her perfect pie, beaten not by beauty, not by wealth, not by charm, but by the very woman she had tried to erase. Sheriff Pike gave a weak smile toward Ethan. Well, Walker, looks like you get to choose again. Still want this cook? It was meant to lighten the air, maybe even to make the crowd laugh kindly instead of cruelly. But Ethan did not treat it as a joke. He stepped onto the platform beside Clara, close enough that she no longer stood alone, but not so close that his sighs swallowed her moment. He took off his hat. I chose Clara when most of you refused to see her, he said. Today you saw what I saw, and I still choose her. Clara's eyes filled before she could stop them. She looked out at the town, waiting for the laugh that had followed her most of her life. It did not come. Sheriff Pike turned to Vivian. Miss Hart, you owe Miss Bennett an apology. Vivian's mouth trembled with fury. For what? For wanting standards, for knowing a woman like her should not be made into some kind of prize. That sentence did more damage to Vivian than any confession. The crowd heard the poison clearly now, because it was no longer hidden under lace. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and faced her. I don't need you to like me, she said. I only need you to stop trying to make me disappear. Vivian had no answer. Pike ordered her from the contest grounds before sundown, and she left with her pie untouched, carrying the silence she had earned. Clara stayed on the platform with a blue ribbon in one hand and a bowl of soup cooling in the other, still unsure what to do with a victory that did not ask her to shrink. Ethan leaned close enough for only her to hear. You ready to go home? Clara looked toward Walker Ridge in the distance, then back at the town that had finally seen her. Yes, she said, but not because I'm running. The ride back to Walker Ridge was quieter than the ride to the fair, but it was not the same kind of quiet. Clara sat beside Ethan with the blue ribbon folded in her lap and the old stew pot wrapped behind the wagon seat. Dusthaven faded behind them, and for the first time in years, Clara did not feel the town pulling her backward by the apron strings. Still, when a wagon passed on the road and the driver lifted his hand, Clara lowered her eyes before she could stop herself. Ethan noticed. He did not correct her. He only slowed the team and tipped his hat to the man until Clara saw there had been no laughter in the greeting. That night, the ranch hands waited outside the kitchen with no speeches prepared. Silas had fixed the loose step by the door. Another man had scrubbed the long table. Someone had placed a chipped blue vase in the center, with prairie flowers leaning out of it, uneven and honest. Clara stood there, holding the ribbon, unsure where to put a prize she had never expected to own. Wherever you set it, Silas said, we'll know what it means. So Clara pinned it above the stove, not because it was pretty, but because that was where she had fought her hardest battles. For a while, victory did not cure old fear. Clara still rose before dawn and checked the pantry, twice afraid someone might say she was wasting food. She still took the smallest piece of cornbread unless Ethan quietly switched plates with her. When visitors came to Walker Ridge, she still wiped her hands too fast and looked for a shadowed corner before remembering the kitchen had become hers. Healing came slowly through ordinary things repeated until they became true. Ethan kept pulling out her chair. The men kept waiting until she sat before they started eating. When ranchers rode in from neighboring spreads, they asked for Clara, by name, not the cook. A miner from the fair sent a sack of coffee beans with a note saying her soup had carried him through the coldest road home. Sheriff Pike came one Sunday, hat in hand, and admitted Dusthaven had been wrong longer than it had been willing to say. Clara did not become proud. She became steady. By winter, Walker Ridge was known less for the size of its herd than for the light in its kitchen windows. Men passing after dark found coffee warm on the stove. Widows bringing trade goods left with bread wrapped in cloth. Hungry drifters were given soup if they washed their hands and spoke with respect. Clara never let her table become charity with a sharp edge. She knew too well what it meant to be fed and shamed at the same time. One evening after the first snow touched the ridge, Ethan found Clara on the porch looking toward Dusthaven. She wore her brown dress mended clean, and the silver light made the flower on her sleeve look almost like frost. He held out a small ring, plain silver, no grand stone, no fancy engraving. The day Pike told me to pick any cook, he said folks thought I was choosing supper. I reckon I was choosing home. Clara's breath caught. Have you ever been ashamed of it? Ethan stepped closer. The only shame would have been not choosing you, when my heart already knew. She did not answer at first. The woman who had once stood at the back of the jail yard, ready to carry her pot away, looked down at that ring and let herself be seen. Then she gave him her hand. They married in spring, not in a grand hall, but under the cottonwoods near the ranch house. Dusthaven came quieter than before and better for it. Vivian Hart did not attend. Clara did not ask after her. Some hurts lose their power when a person stops building a home around them. Years later, folks still talked about the fair, but the story changed as it traveled. It was no longer only about a ruined stew, a jealous woman, or a cowboy too stubborn to follow the crowd. It became the story of the day Dusthaven learned that beauty could fill a mirror and still leave a table empty, while a heart overlooked by everyone could feed a whole town back to decency. The old stew pot never left Walker Ridge. Clara kept it on a shelf above the stove, blackened, dented, and clean. Beside it hung the iron ladle she had dropped in the jail yard, the one that had once made every laughing face turn toward her. Only now, when that ladle rang against the pot, no one laughed. They came to the table, and if this story reminded you that one brave choice can give a forgotten soul the courage to stand in the light, right, he chose her in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe for more frontier stories where kindness still has the strength to change a town.